The drought had turned Sarah's wheat field into a graveyard of cracked earth and dying dreams. 8 months pregnant and facing foreclosure, she walked the barren land one last time before the bank seized everything her family had built over 3 generations. Then the ground gave way beneath her feet, revealing a perfectly circular hole 30 feet wide, dropping into absolute darkness. What she saw in the beam of her flashlight made her blood turn to ice. Dozens of bodies lay arranged in perfect rows, their clothes from the 1980s, their faces untouched by decay. Sarah recognized the faded red jacket immediately. It belonged to her sister Emma, who had vanished 23 years ago when their neighboring town of Millbrook mysteriously emptied overnight. But Emma's eyes were open and blinking. Sarah had spent 2 decades as a forensic anthropologist before returning home to help with the farm. She knew death, understood decomposition, could read bones like others read books. Nothing in her training had prepared her for this. These people weren't just preserved, they were waiting. What had taken an entire town, and why was it keeping them alive? The baby kicked hard against Sarah's ribs, as if sensing her terror. He stumbled backward from the edge, her hand instinctively protecting her swollen belly. The flashlight beam wavered, casting dancing shadows across the impossible scene below. Emma's face turned slightly, following the light with those familiar green eyes that Sarah remembered from childhood. "No," Sarah whispered, her voice barely audible over the wind that had begun to pick up. "This isn't real." But even as she spoke the words, her scientific mind catalogued the details. The bodies were arranged in precise rows of 12, like some grotesque garden. Their skin had the waxy pallor of corpses, yet no signs of decomposition, no bloating, no discoloration beyond the unnatural whiteness. Their clothes, jeans, flannel shirts, children's pajamas, were faded but intact, as if time had simply stopped. Sarah counted quickly, 48 bodies visible in her flashlight's reach, though the whole seemed to extend beyond what she could see. The entire population of Millbrook had been just over 300 people. She thought of that October night in 2000, when 17-year-old Emma had driven to Millbrook for a Halloween party. The next morning, the town was empty, every soul gone, cars still in driveways, doors left open, dinners half-eaten on tables. The FBI had investigated for months, finding no trace of the residents, no signs of violence, no evidence of mass exodus. An entire community had simply vanished. Now, Sarah knew where they'd gone. Emma's lips parted slightly, and Sarah could swear she heard something, a whisper so faint it might have been wind through the dried wheat stalks. Her sister's hand twitched, fingers moving with deliberate intent, beckoning. The rational part of Sarah's mind screamed this was impossible. People didn't survive underground for 23 years. They didn't remain perfectly preserved without decay, but the evidence lay before her, defying every law of biology she understood. She pulled out her phone, fingers trembling as she tried to dial 911. No signal. The screen flickered and went black, despite showing a full battery moments earlier. The flashlight dimmed, its beam growing weaker, as if something below was draining its power. In the fading light, Sarah saw movement throughout the hole. Dozens of heads turning in her direction, eyes opening, hands beginning to shift and flex. A sound rose from the depths, not quite human, not quite animal. A collective sigh that seemed to carry words she couldn't quite understand. The baby kicked again, harder this time, and Sarah felt a sharp pain in her lower back. She needed to get away from this place, needed to call for help, needed to think. But as she turned to leave, the ground beneath her feet shifted ominously. Cracks spread outward from the hole's edge, spiderwebbing through the dry earth. The hole was expanding. Sarah ran, her pregnant form making her movements clumsy and slow. Behind her she could hear the sound of earth falling, of the sinkhole growing larger. The whispers grew louder, becoming a chorus that seemed to follow her across the field. When she reached her truck, she risked one look back. The hole had doubled in size, and figures were climbing out. They moved with jerky, unnatural motions like marionettes guided by an inexperienced hand. Even from this distance, she could see their pale faces turned toward her. Emma stood among them, that red jacket bright as fresh blood in the moonlight. Sarah's hands shook as she started the engine. In her rearview mirror, she watched the figures spread across her family's land like a plague. They weren't walking toward town or the road. They were moving with purpose, following some invisible trail. As she drove away, Sarah realized with growing horror what they were following. Her scent, her path home, and behind them, the hole continued to grow, revealing more rows of the perfectly preserved dead. The smell hit Sarah first, not decay but something else entirely, something sweet and organic, like overripe fruit mixed with wet earth. She pressed her hand against her swollen belly as the baby kicked, seemingly responding to her elevated heart rate. "Jesus Christ," Tom whispered beside her, his flashlight beam dancing across the impossible scene below. The sinkhole stretched nearly 40 feet across, its edges jagged where the earth had simply collapsed inward. But it was the bottom that made Sarah's legs go weak. Bodies lay scattered across the muddy floor, dozens of them, maybe more, and they looked fresh. "We need to call the sheriff," Tom said, but his voice sounded far away. Sarah couldn't move, couldn't breathe, because there, near the eastern edge of the hole, lay a small figure in a yellow dress. The same yellow dress with tiny blue flowers that their mother had sewn by hand. The same dress Emma had been wearing the day she disappeared 23 years ago. "Sarah?" Tom's hand found her shoulder. "Honey, you're shaking." She pointed with a trembling finger. That's Emma." Tom squinted into the darkness, adjusting his flashlight beam. The figure was maybe 30 feet down, partially obscured by shadows and other bodies. "Sarah, you can't possibly—" "I know that dress." The words came out as a croak. "I helped Mama make it." The impossible thing wasn't just that the bodies looked preserved, it was how they were positioned, not scattered randomly as if they'd fallen, but arranged almost deliberately. Some lay in neat rows, others in small circles, as if they'd been gathered for some purpose. And in the center of it all, something dark and glistening caught the flashlight beam. Something that pulsed. "Tom." Sarah grabbed his arm so hard he winced. "Look at the middle. Do you see that?" He followed her gaze and went still. The dark mass was roughly the size of a car, but organic, all curves and wet surfaces that seemed to shift and breathe in the light. Thin tendrils extended from it like roots or veins, snaking between the bodies, connecting to them. "What the hell is that thing?" Tom's voice had dropped to barely above a whisper. Before Sarah could answer, one of the tendrils twitched. The movement was slight but unmistakable, and then, as if responding to their presence, the central mass began to pulse faster, the wet sound of it echoing up from the hole like a massive heartbeat. Sarah stumbled backward, her hand instinctively protecting her belly. The baby was moving frantically now, as if it too could sense the wrongness below. "We have to go. We have to go right now." But Tom was transfixed, leaning closer to the edge. "This doesn't make sense. Millbrook disappeared in 1987. These bodies should be nothing but bones by now." "Tom, please," Sarah tugged at his jacket. "Whatever that thing is down there, it's keeping them like that, preserving them." As if responding to her words, the mass pulsed brighter, and several of the tendrils contracted slightly, drawing the nearest bodies a few inches closer. The sound that accompanied this movement was wet and organic, like someone pulling their foot from deep mud. Tom finally stepped back from the edge, his face pale in the flashlight's glow. "We're calling the state police, the FBI, hell, maybe the CDC. This is way beyond—" A soft rustling sound came from below, followed by what sounded almost like whispering. Both of them froze, straining to listen. The sound came again, definitely voices but too faint and distorted to make out words. "Are they—" Tom's throat worked convulsively. "Are they talking?" Sarah didn't wait to find out. She turned and ran, crashing through the cornstalks toward the house, her pregnant belly making her clumsy and slow. Behind her she heard Tom's footsteps following, his flashlight beam bouncing wildly as he struggled to keep up. They didn't stop until they reached the farmhouse porch, both gasping for breath. Sarah collapsed into one of the old wicker chairs, her heart hammering against her ribs. "The phone," she managed. "Call Sheriff Morrison." Tom nodded and disappeared inside, but Sarah stayed on the porch, staring back toward the field. From this distance, she couldn't see the sinkhole, but she could feel it, a wrongness that seemed to pulse in rhythm with her own heartbeat, or maybe in rhythm with whatever that thing was down there. Her hand moved to her belly again as the baby settled into a restless quiet. 23 years. Emma had been gone 23 years, and now she was down there with that thing, preserved like some kind of specimen. But preserved for what? The whispering sound drifted across the field on the night wind, too faint to understand, but unmistakably there. And for just a moment, Sarah could swear she heard her sister's voice among them, calling her name. The sun hadn't yet crested the horizon when Maya found herself standing at the edge of the sinkhole again, her breath forming small clouds in the crisp morning air. She'd barely slept, her mind churning with questions that seemed to multiply with each passing hour. The baby stirred restlessly in her womb, as if sensing her agitation. She'd left Jake sleeping, his arms stretched across the empty space where she should have been. He'd understand eventually, he always did, but right now she needed answers more than she needed his protective instincts getting in the way. The rope ladder she'd fashioned from the barn's old climbing rope hung over the edge, disappearing into the shadows below. Maya had tested its strength twice before dawn, pulling on each knot with the full weight of her pregnancy behind it. It would hold. The descent was harder than she'd anticipated. Her center of gravity had shifted months ago, and every step down required careful consideration. The walls of the sinkhole were smooth in places, almost glass-like, with veins of something that looked like silver threading through the earth. As she moved deeper, the temperature dropped noticeably, and that sweet smell grew stronger. Not decay, but something else entirely, something that reminded her of lilacs and rain. 20 feet down, the walls opened into a cavern she hadn't been able to see from above. Maya's flashlight beam swept across an impossible space, revealing what looked like the skeletal remains of buildings. Not ruins exactly, but structures that seemed to have been preserved in amber-colored crystal formations that grew from the cavern floor like massive organic sculptures. Her boots touched solid ground, and she realized she was standing on what had once been a street. The pavement was intact, with painted lines still visible beneath a thin layer of that crystalline substance. A street sign, partially encased in the amber growth, read Elm Street in faded green letters. Maya's heart hammered against her ribs. Elm Street. She knew that name from the old county maps her grandfather had shown her as a child. This was Millbrook, or what remained of it. She moved carefully through the preserved town, her flashlight revealing storefront windows that still held their glass, newspaper stands with papers dated July 15th, 1987, and cars that looked like they'd been parked moments ago, their chrome bumpers gleaming through translucent amber cocoons. Everything was perfectly preserved, suspended in time like insects in tree sap. The silence was absolute, except for the soft sound of her footsteps and the occasional drip of condensation from the cavern ceiling. No insects, no rodents, nothing living moved in this crystalline tomb. Yet Maya couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. She found the first body near what had been the town's general store. An elderly man in overalls sitting on a bench, his face peaceful as if he'd simply decided to take a nap. The amber substance had grown around him but not through him, creating a perfect shell that revealed every detail. The pattern of his flannel shirt, the lines around his eyes, even individual grey whiskers on his weathered cheek. Maya approached slowly, pressing her hand against the warm surface of the amber. It pulsed gently under her palm, like a heartbeat, like something alive. More bodies appeared as she ventured deeper into the town. A woman pushing a stroller, both she and the child inside perfectly preserved. A group of teenagers clustered around what had been an ice cream truck, money still clutched in their amber-encased hands. All of them peaceful, their faces showing no signs of fear or pain. It was in the town square, near a fountain that still bubbled with crystal-clear water, that Maya found her. Rebecca sat on the fountain's edge, her 7-year-old face turned upward as if she'd been watching clouds. She wore the same pink sundress she'd disappeared in 23 years ago, the fabric as bright as the day their mother had bought it. Her blonde hair caught the flashlight beam, and for a moment, Maya's breath caught in her throat. Her sister looked exactly as she had the day she'd vanished from the county fair, young, innocent, and impossibly alive beneath the amber shell. Maya's knees gave out, and she found herself kneeling beside the preserved child, her hands pressed against the warm, pulsing surface. Tears blurred her vision as she traced the familiar features of Rebecca's face through the translucent barrier. "I never stopped looking for you," she whispered, her voice echoing in the crystalline cavern. That's when she noticed movement in her peripheral vision, something shifting in the amber formations that surrounded the town square. Not the bodies, they remained still as death, but the amber itself was moving, flowing like honey, and within its depths, Maya caught glimpses of something that made her blood freeze. Eyes, hundreds of them, watching her from within the crystalline walls, blinking slowly in the amber light. The morning sun cast long shadows across the kitchen as Sarah stared at the newspaper clipping she'd found in her mother's old recipe box. The headline read, "Search continues for missing Belmont residents," and the date made her stomach clench. October 15th, 1987. 3 days before Emma had disappeared. She'd been looking for her mother's apple pie recipe when her fingers had brushed against the yellowed paper tucked behind the index cards. Now, reading it for the third time, certain details jumped out that she'd never known before. Belmont hadn't just vanished overnight like the stories claimed. People had been disappearing for weeks leading up to the main event. Farmers, shopkeepers, entire families just gone. The baby kicked hard against her ribs, as if sensing her distress. Sarah rubbed the spot absently while scanning the list of missing persons. 23 names in total, including Harold Voss and his daughter Margaret, the same Margaret whose perfectly preserved body now lay in the sinkhole behind her house. A knock at the door startled her. Through the window, she saw Sheriff Brennan's patrol car in the driveway. Her first instinct was to hide the newspaper, but she forced herself to remain calm as she opened the door. "Morning, Sarah." Brennan removed his hat, his weathered face grave. "Mind if I come in? Need to talk to you about yesterday." She led him to the kitchen table, sliding the newspaper under a stack of bills. "Coffee?" "That'd be nice." He settled into a chair with a grunt. "Sarah, I've been sheriff here for 15 years, and I've never seen anything like what's in that hole." "The preservation, you mean?" She poured coffee with steady hands despite her racing heart. "That's part of it." He accepted the mug gratefully. "I made some calls last night. Contacted the state archaeologist, few other folks. Thing is, nobody wants to touch this. Keep getting passed around like a hot potato." Sarah sat across from him. "What do you mean?" "State says it's a local matter, unless we can prove it's a crime scene. Problem is, how do you prove a crime when the whole damn town that supposedly committed it vanished 37 years ago?" He took a long sip. "And there's something else, something I didn't mention yesterday." The baby shifted again, pressing against Sarah's bladder. She ignored the discomfort. "What?" "I knew your sister, knew Emma well." Brennan's eyes met hers. "She came to see me about a week before she disappeared, said she'd been having dreams about a place underground, filled with people who were sleeping but not dead. Said she could hear them calling to her." The coffee mug slipped in Sarah's grip. She barely caught it before it hit the floor. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying maybe Emma didn't just stumble onto those bodies by accident." His voice was barely above a whisper. "Maybe she was drawn there." Sarah's mind reeled. She remembered Emma's behavior in those final weeks, the sleepwalking, the way she'd stare out at the back pasture for hours, claiming she could hear voices in the wind. Their parents had attributed it to teenage rebellion, but what if it had been something else entirely? Did you search the area back then, after she disappeared? Course we did. Covered every inch of your property and beyond. But here's the thing, Sarah. There was no sinkhole, not even a depression in the ground. Brennan leaned forward. Whatever opened up down there, it happened recently, very recently. A chill ran down Sarah's spine. The heavy rains last month. Maybe triggered it, sure. But sinkholes don't just preserve bodies like that, not for 37 years. He paused. I think your sister found something down there in 1987, something that's been waiting all this time. Through the window, Sarah could see the yellow tape fluttering around the sinkhole like prayer flags. The excavation equipment sat silent and abandoned after yesterday's discovery. She thought about the newspaper clipping hidden beneath the bills, about the pattern of disappearances that had preceded Belmont's vanishing. What do we do now? That's up to you. It's your property, your decision. Brennan stood, leaving his coffee half-finished. But Sarah, if you decide to dig deeper into this, literally or figuratively, you need to be careful, real careful. After he left, Sarah sat in the growing silence, one hand on her belly, the other clutching the newspaper clipping. Emma had been 16 when she'd started having those dreams, the same age Sarah had been when she'd sworn she could hear her sister S voice calling from somewhere far away, somewhere dark and underground. Now, carrying new life inside her, she felt that same pull her sister must have experienced, a whisper in her bones, a certainty that whatever lay sleeping in the sinkhole was finally ready to wake up. The question was whether she had the strength to resist its call, or if history was destined to repeat itself once again. The ladder descended into absolute darkness, each rung slick with moisture that had no business existing this far underground. Sarah's flashlight beam barely penetrated the thick air below, revealing glimpses of smooth rock walls that curved inward like the throat of some primordial beast. The smell hit her halfway down. Not the expected mustiness of earth and decay, but something else entirely, something sweet and cloying, like overripe fruit left too long in summer heat. Her boots touched solid ground with a soft squelch. The surface beneath her feet wasn't rock or packed earth, but something that gave slightly under her weight, almost organic in its texture. Sarah swept her flashlight across the cavern floor and immediately wished she hadn't. The chamber stretched far beyond her light's reach, its walls rising into shadows that seemed to move independently of her beam. But it wasn't the size that made her stomach clench. It was what filled the space, bodies, dozens of them, maybe hundreds, arranged in neat rows like some macabre cemetery. Yet these weren't the skeletal remains she'd expected. Each corpse looked as if it had been placed there yesterday, skin pale but intact, clothing undamaged by time or decay. Sarah forced herself forward, stepping carefully between the rows. Her flashlight revealed faces frozen in expressions of peace, as if death had come gently to each of them. Children clutched toys that should have crumbled to dust decades ago. Women wore dresses in styles from the 1950s, the fabric still vibrant. Men in work clothes lay with their hands folded across their chests, wedding rings gleaming as if freshly polished. She recognized some of them from the old photographs in the County Historical Society. Mayor Patterson, distinguished even in death, the Hendricks family who'd run the general store, Mrs. Carmichael who'd taught at the elementary school for 30 years before Millbrook vanished. All of them perfectly preserved, waiting. But waiting for what? Sarah's breath came in short gasps as she moved deeper into the chamber. The sweet smell grew stronger, and she realized it wasn't coming from the bodies themselves but from something else. Something that pulsed with a faint, rhythmic glow deeper in the darkness. With each pulse, the air shimmered slightly, as if filled with invisible spores or microscopic organisms. That's when she found her. Emma lay near the chamber's center, exactly as Sarah remembered her from that last morning 20 years ago. 12 years old, auburn hair in neat braids, wearing the blue dress with yellow flowers that had been her favorite. Her skin held the same alabaster perfection as the others, unmarked by time or trauma. Even her freckles remained exactly as Sarah remembered them, scattered across her nose like tiny stars. Sarah dropped to her knees beside her sister's body, the flashlight trembling in her grip. This close, she could see the faint rise and fall of Emma's chest, not the jerky movements of someone breathing, but something more subtle, a gentle rhythm that matched the pulsing glow emanating from deeper in the chamber. "Emma?" Sarah whispered, her voice echoing strangely in the space. The sound seemed to be absorbed by the walls themselves, muffled and distant. Emma's eyes opened. Not the cloudy, lifeless gaze Sarah expected, but the same bright green eyes she remembered. They fixed on Sarah's face with unmistakable recognition, and Emma's lips curved into the same shy smile that had always made Sarah's heart melt. "Sarah!" Emma's voice was exactly as it had been, a child's voice, clear and sweet. "You came." Sarah's hand trembled as she reached toward her sister's face, then stopped inches away. "Emma, what happened? Where have you been?" "We're waiting," Emma said, her smile never wavering. "All of us. We've been waiting so long. Waiting for what?" Emma sat up with fluid grace, her movements too smooth, too perfect. Around them, other bodies began to stir. Eyes opened in dozens of faces. Heads turned toward Sarah with synchronized precision. The rhythmic glow grew brighter, and Sarah realized it was coming from beneath the cavern floor itself, pulsing up through hairline cracks in the organic surface. "For the feeding," Emma said, her child's voice taking on harmonics that shouldn't exist in any human throat. "It's almost time again. The sleepers are so hungry." Sarah scrambled backward, her flashlight beam dancing wildly across faces that were no longer peaceful. The preserved residents of Millbrook were rising, their movements coordinated like parts of a single organism. Their eyes reflected her light with an oily sheen, and when they opened their mouths, Sarah saw that their teeth had changed. Elongated, sharpened, designed for tearing rather than chewing. "Don't run, Sarah," Emma said, rising to her feet with the same unnatural grace. "You belong here, with us. The baby belongs here too." The thing wearing her sister's face placed one pale hand on its stomach in a mockery of Sarah's own protective gesture. "New life feeds the old life. That's how it's always been. That's why we called you home." The sheriff's cruiser kicked up a cloud of dust as it pulled into the farmyard, followed by the county coroner's white van. Sarah watched from the kitchen window, her coffee growing cold in trembling hands. She'd barely slept after calling in the discovery, her mind replaying the impossible sight of perfectly preserved bodies lying in that otherworldly cavern. "You did the right thing," Marcus said, though his voice carried doubt. They both knew what this meant. Investigators crawling over their property, media attention they couldn't afford, and questions that might lead to answers she wasn't sure she wanted. Sheriff Coleman emerged from his vehicle, a tall man with graying temples who'd known Sarah since she was Emma's age. Behind him came Dr. Patricia Voss, the county coroner, along with two crime scene technicians hauling equipment cases. Sarah met them at the front door, unconsciously smoothing her shirt over her growing belly. "Sheriff, thank you for coming so quickly." Coleman's weathered face was grim. "Sarah, honey, I have to ask, are you absolutely certain about what you saw down there? Because if this is connected to Millbrook—" He trailed off, but the implication hung heavy between them. "I know how it sounds, but I saw what I saw." The walk to the sinkhole felt endless. Sarah led the group across the drought-cracked fields, pointing out the subtle changes she'd noticed over the past weeks, areas where the soil seemed to shift and settle, creating shallow depressions that hadn't been there before. The earth itself seemed restless, as if something beneath was stirring. When they reached the massive crater, Dr. Voss let out a low whistle. "Jesus Christ, when did this open up?" 3 days ago, after that storm." Sarah peered over the edge, her heart hammering. The ethereal blue glow was fainter in the daylight, but still visible, emanating from the depths like captured moonlight. Coleman radioed for additional equipment while the crime scene team began setting up. Dr. Voss secured a climbing harness, her expression shifting from skepticism to focused professionalism. "Sarah, I need you to understand. If there are human remains down there, this becomes a crime scene. No one else goes near it until we're finished. I understand, but Doctor... Sarah grabbed her arm. Be careful. There's something else down there. Something that doesn't feel right. The coroner studied her face, perhaps recognizing something in Sarah's eyes that couldn't be dismissed as hysteria. What kind of something? Sarah struggled to put the feeling into words, like the air is thick, alive, and the smell, it's not decay, it's something else entirely. As the team prepared for descent, Sarah noticed movement in her peripheral vision. Emma stood at the edge of the field, partially hidden behind the old oak tree, watching the proceedings with an intensity that made Sarah's skin crawl. There was something different about her daughter's posture, the way she held herself perfectly still, as if listening to something only she could hear. "Emma," Sarah called, "come away from there." But Emma didn't respond. She seemed transfixed, her small hands pressed against the tree trunk. Sarah started toward her, but Coleman's sharp intake of breath drew her attention back to the sinkhole. Dr. Voss had reached the bottom and was standing among the bodies. Even from above, Sarah could see her shock as she moved between the perfectly preserved forms. The coroner's voice crackled through the radio, professional composure barely masking her bewilderment. "Coleman, you need to see this. These bodies, they're not decomposed at all. It's like they were placed here yesterday, but the clothing, the hairstyles, they're definitely from decades ago." Sarah's breath caught as Dr. Voss knelt beside one particular form. Even from this distance, she could make out the familiar yellow dress, the dark hair spread like a fan across the strange, luminescent ground. "There's a child here," Dr. Voss continued, her voice tight. "Female, approximately 8 years old, wearing a yellow sundress. No visible trauma, no signs of decay. It's..." She paused, and when she spoke again, her voice was barely a whisper. "It's impossible." The radio crackled with static, then fell silent. Coleman tried to raise her again, but received no response. He grabbed the spare headset and started rigging his own descent line. Sarah turned back toward Emma, but the space beneath the oak tree was empty. Panic fluttered in her chest as she scanned the field, finally spotting her daughter walking slowly toward the farmhouse, her movements oddly mechanical. A sound drew Sarah's attention back to the sinkhole, a low humming that seemed to rise from the depths, barely audible but felt in her bones. The blue glow was intensifying, pulsing rhythmically like a massive heartbeat. The crime scene technicians stepped back from the edge, their equipment registering readings that made no sense. Below, Dr. Voss had stopped moving entirely. She stood frozen among the preserved bodies, her head tilted as if listening to something beyond human hearing. The humming grew stronger, and Sarah felt an answering vibration in her chest, something that seemed to resonate with the life growing inside her. Whatever force had preserved those bodies for decades was waking up, and it knew they were there. The old library smelled of dust and decay, its fluorescent lights flickering overhead as Maya spread the newspaper clippings across the scratched wooden table. Each headline screamed variations of the same impossible story: entire town vanishes overnight, and harrowing mystery baffles authorities, and search for Millbrook continues. Her hands trembled as she read account after account of the disappearance. 312 people, gone without a trace on October 13th, 1987. The same night Sarah had vanished. Find what you're looking for? Maya jumped, her heart hammering against her ribs. The librarian, a thin woman with wire-rimmed glasses, stood behind her, holding a stack of bound volumes. "I'm researching Millbrook," Maya said, trying to keep her voice steady. "The town that disappeared." The librarian's expression shifted, something guarded creeping into her pale eyes. "That's ancient history. Nothing good comes from digging up the past. My sister went missing that same night. I think she might have been there." The woman set the volumes down with deliberate care, her fingers lingering on the worn covers. "What's your name, honey?" "Maya Holloway." "Well, it was Chen before I married." Recognition flickered across the librarian's face. "You're Jun Chen's daughter, the one who moved away." She glanced around the empty library, then leaned closer. There are things about that night that never made it into the papers, things the authorities buried along with the investigation. Maya's pulse quickened. What kind of things? Come with me. The librarian led her through narrow aisles to a locked door marked Archives. Inside, filing cabinets lined the walls, and the air tasted stale and forgotten. The woman pulled out a manila folder thick with documents and photographs. "My name is Ellen," she said, opening the folder. "My brother was one of the state investigators assigned to the Millbrook case. He brought me copies of everything before he died. Lung cancer, but he swore it was from breathing that air." She spread out crime scene photographs that made Maya's stomach lurch. The images showed Millbrook's main street, but something was wrong with them. The buildings looked organic. Walls bulged like breathing chest cavities, and windows had taken on an almost eye-like quality. Dark substance oozed from doorways, pooling in the gutters like oil. The official report claimed a gas leak caused mass hallucinations, leading to a collective exodus, Ellen continued. But these photos tell a different story. The town didn't empty, it transformed. Maya picked up a photograph showing what had once been the town square. In the center, where a fountain should have been, gaped a massive hole. Even in the grainy black and white image, she could see bodies arranged in perfect spirals descending into darkness. "This hole," Maya whispered, her free hand instinctively moving to her swollen belly. "It's the same one on our property." The sinkhole opened up in the exact same spot. Ellen's face went white. "That's impossible. The government sealed that area, filled it with concrete and posted warnings. Well, it's open again, and the bodies are still down there, perfectly preserved." Maya's voice cracked. "Including my sister." Ellen fumbled through the papers, pulling out a geological survey. According to this, the hole went down over 400 feet. The teams that descended reported finding some kind of ecosystem, a living network that had been feeding on the groundwater for centuries. The baby kicked hard, and Maya gasped, doubling over. For a moment she could swear she felt something else moving inside her, something that wasn't the baby. The sensation passed, leaving her nauseated and dizzy. "Are you all right?" Ellen asked, reaching out to steady her. "I'm fine," Maya lied, straightening up. "What happened to the investigation teams?" Ellen's silence stretched too long. Finally, she pulled out a final photograph. It showed 5 people in hazmat suits standing at the edge of the hole, their faces visible through clear face shields. They looked normal enough except for their eyes, completely black, reflecting the camera flash like an animal's. "They came back, changed," Ellen whispered, "started talking about being called home and feeding the source. 3 of them walked into the forest and were never found. The other 2, she shuddered. Let's just say they didn't stay human for long." Maya stared at the photograph, memorizing every detail. The thing growing inside Millbrook's foundations hadn't died when the government sealed the hole. It had simply waited, patient and hungry, for another opportunity to feed. "I need copies of everything," she said. "You need to leave," Ellen replied firmly. "Take your family and go far away. Don't go back to that farm." But Maya was already gathering the photographs, her mind racing. Sarah was down there, waiting. And now she understood why her sister had never truly felt gone, because she wasn't. None of them were. The thing in the hole had kept them all. The basement of the Millbrook Historical Society smelled like old paper and forgotten time. Sarah followed Mrs. Chen down creaking wooden stairs, her hand trailing along a banister worn smooth by decades of use. Fluorescent lights flickered overhead, casting dancing shadows across towers of cardboard boxes and filing cabinets that seemed to stretch into infinity. "Most people don't know we keep the really old records down here," Mrs. Chen said, her voice echoing in the cramped space. "Town council prefers to focus on the positive aspects of Millbrook's history. Tourism, you understand." Sarah's stomach churned, though whether from morning sickness or dread she couldn't tell. The baby had been restless all night, as if sensing her growing unease. "What exactly are you going to show me?" Mrs. Chen stopped before a particular filing cabinet, its metal surface rust-stained and dented. She produced an old key from her cardigan pocket. Records from 1952, the year Harmony disappeared. The lock clicked open with surprising ease. But also records from before, things that might explain why your family's land has always been troubled. A drawer slid open with a metallic screech. Inside, manila folders sat in neat rows, their tabs yellowed with age. Mrs. Chen's fingers walked across them until she found what she sought. Here! She pulled out a thick folder and carried it to a nearby table, brushing off a layer of dust. Sit, dear. This might take a while. The first document made Sarah's blood run cold. It was a surveyor's map from 1923 showing the land that would eventually become the Whitmore farm. But instead of open fields, the map depicted a massive depression in the earth, a natural bowl surrounded by ridges. Someone had written in careful script along the margin, "Local tribe warns against settlement. Say the earth here drinks the living." "I don't understand," Sarah whispered. "Your great-grandfather bought that land cheap in 1924, Mrs. Chen explained, turning to the next page. "Dirt cheap, if you'll pardon the expression. The previous owner was desperate to sell after his cattle started disappearing." The next document was a newspaper clipping from the Millbrook Gazette, dated September 15, 1925. The headline read, "Mysterious illness strikes Whitmore livestock." The article described cattle found standing motionless in the fields, alive but unresponsive, their eyes clouded white. Within days they would simply lie down and never get up again, though veterinarians could find no cause of death. "But they filled in that depression," Sarah said, remembering her grandfather's stories about leveling the land for farming. "Built up the soil." "Oh yes, they tried." Mrs. Chen's smile held no warmth. "Brought in tons of earth and rock. Thought they could bury the problem." She flipped through several more pages until she reached another newspaper clipping. "Look at this one." The date was October 1926. "Second attempt to fill Millbrook depression fails." The article described how trucks full of soil would dump their loads only to find them gone by morning, as if the earth had swallowed them whole. Workers reported feeling dizzy and disoriented near the center of the depression. 3 men had to be hospitalized after collapsing during the work. "They eventually gave up the filling project," Mrs. Chen continued. "But not your great-grandfather. He was stubborn, decided to farm around it, leave that one section wild. Until what?" The next clipping was from 1928. "Whitmore child missing." Sarah's heart hammered as she read about her great-uncle Thomas, age 7, who had wandered into the wild section of the farm and never returned. Search parties found no trace of him. After that, they filled it in with concrete first, then soil, Mrs. Chen said quietly. "Seemed to work. The land was quiet for years. Your grandfather grew up there without incident, until the 1950s, when they started having problems again." The documents that followed painted a picture Sarah wished she could unsee. Reports of strange sounds coming from the earth at night. Neighbors complaining of nightmares about voices calling from underground. And then, finally, the report about Harmony, an entire town of 300 people simply gone one morning, leaving behind empty houses and cars still warm in driveways. The official explanation was mass evacuation due to contaminated groundwater, Mrs. Chen said. "But look at this." She pulled out a police report, partially redacted but still readable. Officers' notes from the initial investigation. Sarah read the handwritten scrawl. Houses show no signs of struggle or hasty departure. Breakfast still on tables, some still warm. Children's toys scattered as if dropped mid-play, but no bodies anywhere. Most disturbing, could hear what sounded like voices coming from storm drains and basement floors. Following sounds led to old Whitmore property boundary. "The sinkhole," Sarah breathed. "It's connected to where Harmony was." Mrs. Chen nodded grimly. "What your family buried isn't dead, Sarah. It's been waiting, and I think it's tired of waiting." Outside, thunder rumbled despite the clear sky, and Sarah felt the baby kick urgently against her ribs. The preservation chamber stretched deeper than Elena had imagined, its walls pulsing with that sickly bioluminescent glow. The air grew thicker as she descended the narrow pathway carved into the organic matter, each breath feeling like swallowing honey laced with copper. Behind her, Marcus's flashlight beam danced erratically, betraying his trembling hands. "Elena, we need to go back," he whispered, his voice barely audible over the wet, rhythmic sounds emanating from the walls. "This place, it's not meant for the living." She ignored him, driven by something beyond reason. Sarah was here somewhere. She could feel her sister's presence like a tuning fork vibrating in her chest, growing stronger with each step. The baby kicked frantically, as if trying to warn her away, but Elena pressed on. The pathway opened into a vast cathedral of flesh and bone. Dozens of alcoves lined the curved walls, each one containing a perfectly preserved body suspended in translucent, amber-like substance. Their eyes were closed, faces peaceful, as if they'd simply chosen to take a nap that had lasted 30 years. Men, women, children, an entire community frozen in time. Elena's breath caught as she spotted familiar faces from old photographs Sheriff Hartley had shown her. The missing Millbrook residents, arranged like specimens in some grotesque museum. The organic walls pulsed around them, feeding tubes snaking from unseen sources into each alcove, delivering nutrients to keep their specimens viable. "There," Marcus gasped, pointing to an alcove near the center. "Elena, don't—" But she was already moving, her legs carrying her forward, despite every instinct screaming at her to flee. Sarah hung suspended in her crystalline prison, unchanged from the day she'd vanished. 17 years old, wearing the same yellow sundress she'd had on when Elena last saw her. Her dark hair floated around her face like kelp in an underwater current. Elena pressed her palms against the amber surface, tears streaming down her cheeks. "Sarah, oh God, Sarah, I'm so sorry. I should have looked for you. I should have known." The amber was warm, almost body temperature, and through it she could see the slight rise and fall of her sister's chest. Alive. After all these years, Sarah was alive. "We have to get her out," Elena said, turning to Marcus. "Help me find a way to break this open." Marcus backed away, his face pale. "Elena, look around, really look. This thing, whatever it is, it's been keeping them alive for decades. If we disturb it—" "I don't care!" Elena's voice cracked with desperation. "She's my sister!" A low rumble emanated from the walls, and the bioluminescent glow intensified. The feeding tubes began pumping faster, and several of the suspended figures twitched in their amber cocoons. Elena felt a sharp pain in her abdomen as the baby pressed against her ribs with unusual force. "It knows we're here," Marcus whispered. "It's been watching us since we entered." As if responding to his words, a section of the far wall began to iris open, like a massive eye. Beyond it lay another chamber, and from its depths came a sound that made Elena's blood freeze. A voice, ancient and patient, speaking in harmonics that bypassed her ears and resonated directly in her bones. "Welcome, daughter of the blood." The words formed in her mind, rather than reaching her through air. "You have returned to us at last." Elena's vision blurred as memories that weren't her own flooded her consciousness. The entity beneath their farm, older than human civilization, sleeping until the mining operations had disturbed its slumber, its desperate hunger for connection, for family, driving it to collect and preserve the townspeople of Millbrook. And Sarah, sweet, curious Sarah, who had wandered too close to the sinkhole on that summer day 30 years ago. "You took her," Elena said, her voice hollow with understanding. "You took all of them." "I saved them," the entity replied, its mental voice rippling with genuine confusion at her distress. "They were dying, aging, fading away. I gave them eternity. And now I offer you the same gift, you and the new life you carry." The amber around Sarah began to soften, becoming more transparent. Her sister's eyes fluttered open, focusing on Elena with perfect clarity. Sarah's mouth moved, forming silent words. "Run." Elena stumbled backward as the floor beneath her feet began to shift. organic tendrils emerging from hidden crevices to wrap around her ankles. The entity's presence pressed against her mind, overwhelming and ancient, filled with a loneliness so profound it made her gasp. "You don't understand," she managed to say, as the tendrils climbed higher. "We're not meant to live forever. We're meant to live, truly live, not just exist." Marcus grabbed her arm, pulling against the restraining tendrils. "Elena, we have to go now!" But the entity's grip was tightening, both physically and mentally, and Elena realized with growing horror that it had never intended to let them leave. The basement beneath the old farmhouse had been sealed for 40 years, but the floorboards groaned under Sarah's weight as she descended the rotting steps. Her flashlight beam cut through air thick with decay and something else, something sweet and cloying that made her stomach turn. The baby kicked restlessly, as if sensing her distress. Sheriff Martinez followed close behind, his own light dancing across stone walls that wept with moisture. "Sarah, we should wait for the state team." "No." Her voice echoed in the confined space. "Elena's been waiting long enough." The basement stretched further than it should have, extending well beyond the farmhouse's foundation. Ancient timber supports disappeared into darkness, and the air grew warmer with each step. Sarah's light found strange markings carved into the walls, symbols that seemed to shift and writhe when she wasn't looking directly at them. "Jesus," Martinez whispered, stopping at a section where the stone wall had crumbled away entirely, revealing a tunnel that sloped downward at a steep angle. "This connects to the sinkhole system." Sarah pressed forward, ignoring his protests. The tunnel walls were lined with the same preservation medium they'd found coating the bodies, a translucent, amber-like substance that pulsed with its own inner light. But here, in these depths, she could see it was alive. Veins of bioluminescence threaded through the walls like a vast circulatory system, pumping some unknown fluid through organic conduits. The tunnel opened into a vast underground chamber that took her breath away. It was a mirror image of Millbrook, as she remembered it from old photographs, streets and buildings perfectly preserved in crystalline amber, stretching as far as her flashlight could reach. But this wasn't a tomb. This was something far worse. People moved through the amber streets below, their movements slow and dreamlike. Sarah recognized Mrs. Henderson from the post office, her face unchanged from 40 years ago. There was Tommy Brennan, who'd been 7 when the town vanished, still 7 now, playing with a ball that never bounced in the thick, viscous air. And there, walking toward what had once been the town square, was Elena. Sarah's scream died in her throat. Her sister moved with the same languid grace as the others, her 19-year-old face serene and untouched by time. She wore the same blue sundress she'd disappeared in, but now it seemed to float around her like liquid silk. Sarah Martinez's hand gripped her shoulder. "We need to leave, now!" But Sarah was already climbing down the rough-hewn steps that led to the amber streets. The preservation medium was warm and thick, like walking through honey, but it didn't impede her breathing. Instead, it seemed to fill her lungs with something that tasted of copper and old flowers. Elena turned as Sarah approached, her eyes the same warm brown they'd always been, but filmed with something that reflected the bioluminescent glow. When she smiled, Sarah saw that her teeth had been replaced with crystalline formations that caught and refracted the light. "Sarah!" Elena's voice was layered, harmonized with something that vibrated through the amber itself. "You came back. Elena, oh God, Elena." Sarah reached out, but her sister stepped back, shaking her head. "I can't leave, Sarah. None of us can. It won't let us." Elena's crystalline teeth caught the light as she spoke. "But you shouldn't have come here. Not while you're carrying life." The amber around them began to pulse more rapidly, and Sarah felt something vast and ancient stirring in the depths below the preserved town. The ground trembled, and she realized they were standing on something immense, something that breathed and thought and hungered. "What is this place?" Sarah whispered. "A nursery," Elena said, her voice growing more layered with each word. "It's been sleeping for so long, but now it's almost ready to wake. It's been feeding on us, learning from us, preparing." She placed a hand on her stomach, and Sarah saw with horror that her sister's belly was swollen with pregnancy. Not human pregnancy, but something that moved with too many limbs beneath the skin. "We're all pregnant now," Elena continued, and Sarah saw it was true. Every woman in the amber streets carried the same alien swelling. "It needs us to birth its children into your world, and now that you're here, carrying human life," she smiled that terrible crystalline smile, "it can finally bridge the gap between its realm and yours." The amber around Sarah began to thicken, rising up her legs like quicksand. She tried to run, but her movements were growing sluggish. Above her, she could hear Martinez shouting, but his voice seemed to come from very far away. "Don't fight it," Elena whispered, reaching out to touch Sarah's belly. "Your child will be the first, the herald, and you'll be so happy here with us. Time doesn't matter, pain doesn't matter. Nothing matters except serving the purpose." Sarah felt her baby respond to Elena's touch, kicking violently, and for one terrifying moment, she wondered if it was trying to kick its way out, or if something else was trying to kick its way in. The basement door stood open, like a mouth waiting to swallow her whole. Sarah clutched the flashlight so tightly her knuckles had gone white, the beam dancing across the wooden steps that descended into absolute darkness. Behind her, the kitchen felt like a different world, one where coffee cups sat on counters and morning light filtered through curtains, where normal people lived normal lives. She wasn't normal people anymore. The first step creaked under her weight, and she paused, listening. The house was silent except for the distant hum of the refrigerator and her own ragged breathing. Marcus was still at the sheriff's office, probably spinning the same lies he'd been telling for weeks. But Sarah knew better now. The journal entries, the photographs, the careful documentation of things that should never have been documented. It was all down there waiting for her. Each step took her deeper into the musty darkness. The beam of her flashlight caught glimpses of familiar shapes, her grandmother's canning jars lined up on wooden shelves, Christmas decorations in cardboard boxes, the old rocking horse she'd ridden as a child. Normal basement things, but Sarah knew that behind the false wall Marcus had so carefully constructed, nothing would be normal at all. She found the loose panel exactly where she remembered it, hidden behind a stack of paint cans. Her fingers traced the edges until she located the small indentation that served as a handle. The panel swung away silently, revealing a narrow space that reeked of earth and something else, something organic and wrong. The flashlight beam penetrated the hidden room, and Sarah's breath caught in her throat. The space was larger than it had appeared from her brief glimpse before, carved directly into the bedrock beneath the house. The walls were covered in photographs, hundreds of them, pinned to corkboards like specimens in a collection. But these weren't family photos or landscapes. They were all of the sinkhole. Sarah stepped closer, her feet crunching on scattered papers. The photographs showed the crater from every angle, taken across what must have been years. Some were clearly recent, shot with a digital camera, but others had the faded quality of older film. In the earliest ones, the sinkhole was smaller, just a depression in the earth. But as she moved along the wall, following the chronological progression Marcus had so meticulously arranged, she watched it grow. And she watched the bodies appear. The first corpse showed up in a photograph dated 15 years ago, just a pale shape visible beneath the black water. But subsequent images revealed more and more, until the crater became a grotesque underwater cemetery. Sarah's hands shook as she recognized faces among the preserved dead. Mrs. Henderson from the post office, who'd supposedly moved to Florida, the Garrett twins, who'd vanished during a camping trip. And there, in a photograph so recent the edges were still sharp, was Emma. Her sister floated near the surface, her blonde hair fanned out like seaweed, her eyes closed as if she were simply sleeping. But Emma had been missing for 23 years. She should have been bones by now, not this eerily perfect corpse that looked exactly as she had the day she disappeared. Sarah's flashlight beam found a desk in the corner, its surface covered with journals and loose papers. She approached it slowly, afraid of what she might find but unable to stop herself. The most recent journal lay open. Marcus's careful handwriting covering page after page. Day 5847. The feeding was successful. 3 new specimens added to the collection. The entity shows signs of increased activity. The preservation process is accelerating. Note: must relocate Sarah before she discovers the truth. The pregnancy complicates matters, but the child could prove valuable. The words blurred as tears filled Sarah's eyes. Feeding, specimens, the child could prove valuable. She flipped backward through the pages, scanning Marcus's methodical documentation of horror. He'd been feeding people to whatever lived in that sinkhole for decades, luring them, killing them, dumping their bodies into that black water where something kept them fresh and perfect, like flowers pressed between the pages of a book. A sound from upstairs made her freeze. Footsteps. Marcus was home. Sarah grabbed the journal and stuffed it inside her jacket, then switched off the flashlight. In the sudden darkness, the basement felt alive around her, as if the walls themselves were breathing. She crept toward the panel, her hands shaking as she tried to fit it back into place. The footsteps moved through the kitchen above her head, then stopped. "Sarah?" Marcus's voice drifted down through the floorboards. "You home, honey?" She held her breath, pressed against the false wall in absolute darkness. The basement stairs creaked as he began to descend, and Sarah realized with crystalline clarity that she was trapped. There was no other way out of the hidden room, no escape route Marcus hadn't planned for. "Sarah?" His voice was closer now, almost at the bottom of the stairs. "I know you're down here." The basement of the Whitmore house smelled like decades of decay and something else, something alive and fetid that made Sarah's pregnancy-sensitive stomach lurch. She pressed one hand to her mouth, the other to her rounded belly, as Tom's flashlight beam swept across the concrete walls. "Jesus Christ!" Tom whispered, his voice barely audible above the sound of their own breathing. The walls were lined with photographs, hundreds of them, spanning what looked like decades. Black and white images from the 1950s and 60s gradually gave way to color Polaroids, then digital prints. But they all shared one horrifying commonality. Every single photograph showed the same face, Lily's face. "That's impossible," Sarah breathed, stepping closer to examine a photograph dated 1967. The image showed her sister at maybe 16, standing in what looked like the town square of Millbrook Falls. The same sister who had been born in 1989. "Tom, that's impossible." But there was more. As Tom moved the light along the wall, Sarah could see Lily in a dozen different decades, a dozen different settings. Sometimes she looked exactly as Sarah remembered her, 23, vibrant, laughing. Other times she appeared older or younger, but always unmistakably Lily. "Look at this one," Tom said, his voice tight with fear. He was pointing to a more recent digital photograph, and Sarah's blood turned to ice when she saw it. The image showed Lily standing next to their father, both of them smiling, in front of the old barn on their property. Sarah recognized her father's favorite flannel shirt, the one he'd been wearing the day he died. The timestamp read 3 months after his funeral. "She was there," Sarah whispered. "She was there when Dad died, and we never knew." Tom grabbed her arm. "Sarah, we need to leave, now." But Sarah was already moving deeper into the basement, drawn by a compulsion she couldn't name. The flashlight beam caught something else, a journal, leather-bound and thick, sitting open on a wooden table. The pages were covered in handwriting she recognized as Dr. Whitmore's, though the entries seemed to span decades. She began to read aloud, her voice shaking. June 15th, 1963. The entity grows stronger. Lily claims she can feel it stirring beneath the earth, calling to her. She says it promised her forever, and I fear she's beginning to believe it. "Sarah, don't," Tom started, but she continued reading. July 2nd, 1963. Lily brought another one today, a young man from 2 towns over. I helped her carry him to the old mine shaft, though God forgive me, I don't know why. When I touched the preservation fluid, I could feel it too, the promise of eternity, of never losing the ones we love. Sarah's hands trembled as she flipped through pages, scanning entries that jumped through time in impossible ways. Some were dated in the 1960s, others in the 1990s, still others from just last year, all in the same handwriting. August 14th, 1989. Today, Lily was born again, in a different family, to different parents. The entity keeps its promises. She remembers nothing of who she was before, but when the time comes, she always finds her way back to me, back to us. "Oh God," Sarah whispered, understanding beginning to dawn like a sick sunrise. "She's not my sister. She never was my sister." The baby kicked hard against her ribs, as if responding to her distress, and Sarah gasped. In that moment of silence, they heard it, footsteps on the floor above them, slow and deliberate. Tom reached for his phone, but there was no signal. The basement suddenly felt smaller, more confined, as if the walls were pressing inward. December 1st, 2019, Sarah continued reading, unable to stop herself. Sarah Morrison has discovered the sinkhole. Lily is excited. She says this one is special, pregnant. The entity has been whispering to her about the child, about what it could become if properly nurtured. "I've prepared the preservation chamber." The footsteps above them stopped directly over their heads. Then, impossibly, Lily's voice drifted down through the floorboards, sweet and familiar and wrong. "Sarah, I know you're down there. Dr. Whitmore called me. He said you might be confused, but don't worry, everything's going to make sense soon." Tom was already moving toward the basement stairs, but Sarah grabbed his arm. On the final page of the journal, she could see a rough map drawn in black ink. It showed the sinkhole, the farmhouse, and something else, a network of tunnels connecting them all, with the Morrison property marked as the center. "The farm," she whispered to Tom. "It was never about saving the farm. The sinkhole, the preserved bodies, they're all connected to our land. That thing has been using our property as its feeding ground for decades." The basement door creaked open above them, and Lily's silhouette appeared at the top of the stairs, backlit by the pale afternoon light filtering through the house's dirty windows. "Sarah, honey, come up here. We need to talk about your baby." The thing that had been wearing Dr. Hendrick's face dissolved into writhing tendrils of black organic matter before reforming into something altogether more horrifying. Sarah pressed herself against the cavern wall, her heart hammering as the creature's true form revealed itself, a mass of glistening flesh that pulsed with an alien rhythm, countless eye-like nodes opening and closing across its surface like breathing wounds. "You should not have come back," it spoke, though it no longer possessed a mouth. The voice emanated from within the very walls themselves. The harvest was nearly complete. Marcus raised his shotgun with trembling hands, but Sarah knew conventional weapons would be useless. This thing had been feeding on the town of Millhaven for decades, preserving its victims in some twisted communion while slowly draining their essence. The perfectly preserved bodies weren't corpses. They were still alive, trapped in a nightmare state of suspended animation. "Where is my sister?" Sarah demanded, forcing herself to step forward, despite every instinct screaming at her to run. "Where is Emma?" The creature's form shifted, tendrils reaching toward the ceiling where more of the preserved figures hung like macabre fruit. "She serves a greater purpose now. As will you, as will the new life you carry." Sarah's hand instinctively moved to her belly. The baby had been unusually active lately, and now she wondered with growing horror if that was coincidence. Had this thing already begun influencing her unborn child? "The offspring will be perfect," the creature continued, reading her thoughts. "Born already in communion with our consciousness, the first of a new generation." "Like hell," Marcus snarled, firing both barrels directly into the creature's center mass. The shotgun blast tore through writhing flesh, but the wounds immediately began sealing themselves. If anything, the creature seemed amused. "Your weapons cannot harm what has transcended death itself. We are beyond your crude understanding of biology. We are evolution." The tendrils lashed out with impossible speed. Marcus dove sideways, pulling Sarah with him as black appendages smashed into the rock where they had been standing. Chunks of limestone rained down, and Sarah realized the creature's anger was destabilizing the entire chamber. The tunnels, she gasped, pointing toward a narrow passage she'd noticed earlier. We have to reach the surface. They ran, flashlight beams dancing wildly across the cavern walls as inhuman shrieks echoed behind them. The preserved bodies swayed on their organic tethers, and Sarah swore she could see some of them trying to turn their heads to mouth warnings or pleas for help. The passage narrowed, forcing them to crawl on hands and knees through spaces barely wide enough for their bodies. Sarah's pregnancy made the tight confines even more challenging, but adrenaline drove her forward. Behind them, she could hear the creature flowing like liquid through the tunnels, its bulk somehow compressing to fit spaces that should have been impossible. There, Marcus pointed ahead where a shaft of pale daylight filtered down through a crack in the earth. Natural chimney. We can climb it. Sarah looked up at the nearly vertical ascent and felt despair wash over her. In her condition, she'd never make it. But as the sound of pursuit grew closer, she forced herself to begin climbing, finding handholds in the rough limestone. Halfway up, her foot slipped. She dangled by her fingertips, Marcus straining to pull her up, while rocks scattered into the darkness below. That's when the tendrils erupted from the passage beneath them, writhing upward like seeking serpents. "Climb!" Marcus shouted, practically hauling her bodily up the chimney. "Don't look back!" But Sarah did look back, and what she saw made her blood freeze. The creature wasn't just pursuing them, it was herding them, driving them toward the surface for a reason she couldn't yet comprehend. They burst from the ground near the edge of the sinkhole, gasping and covered in limestone dust. The familiar weight of open sky felt like salvation, but their relief was short-lived. All around the farm she could see them now, figures emerging from smaller sinkholes that had opened like wounds in the earth. The perfectly preserved residents of Millhaven, walking with jerky, puppet-like movements toward the farmhouse. "It's not just in the cave," Sarah whispered in dawning horror. "It's everywhere, under the whole valley." The creature had been patient, taking its time to spread through the underground network, establishing anchor points beneath every major building and farm in the area. The sinkhole wasn't the source. It was just one feeding chamber in a vast underground organism that stretched for miles. And now, after decades of careful preparation, it was ready to harvest the entire region. From the farmhouse porch, she could see Tom standing motionless in the doorway, his eyes reflecting an alien intelligence. The creature had already reached her family. Sarah felt the baby kick again, harder this time, and realized with mounting terror that she might already be too late for all of them. The thing that emerged from the sinkhole moved like liquid shadow given form, its surface rippling with an oily iridescence that hurt to look at directly. Sarah pressed herself against the barn wall, one hand instinctively protecting her belly, as the creature flowed past the farmhouse windows, leaving streaks of phosphorescent slime that glowed sickly green in the darkness. Through the kitchen window, she could see Marcus barricading the back door with chairs, while Emma huddled in the corner, clutching the radio they'd been using to contact the outside world. The static had grown worse over the past hour, fragmenting any attempt at communication into unintelligible bursts of white noise. The entity paused near the porch, its form shifting and coalescing into something almost human-shaped before dissolving again. Sarah held her breath, remembering Dr. Holloway's frantic notes about the symbiotic organism that had consumed Millbrook 37 years ago. The biologist had theorized it was ancient, possibly predating human civilization, feeding on organic matter and preserving what it couldn't immediately digest. But the preservation wasn't random. It had kept her sister Lucy's body pristine, along with dozens of others, maintaining them in some grotesque pantomime of life. The thought made Sarah's stomach clench with more than just pregnancy nausea. A wet, sliding sound drew her attention back to the creature. It had discovered the trail she'd left while fleeing from the sinkhole, droplets of blood from where she'd scraped her arm on the excavator's twisted metal. The entity followed the crimson path with deliberate hunger, flowing closer to her hiding spot behind the old combine harvester. Sarah's phone buzzed against her hip, the vibration impossibly loud in the silence. The screen showed Marcus calling, probably wondering where she was, but she couldn't risk answering. The creature's attention snapped toward the sound, its mass rippling with anticipation. That's when she saw them. Figures walking through the phosphorescent glow at the sinkhole's edge. People she recognized from the perfectly preserved corpses below, moving with jerky, unnatural gaits like marionettes, guided by an inexperienced puppeteer. Lucy was among them, her teenage face eerily unchanged from Sarah's memories, dark hair still styled in the same bob she'd worn the day she disappeared. The walking dead spread out across the farmyard in a loose semicircle, their glassy eyes reflecting the creature's bioluminescent glow. They moved with purpose, Sarah realized with growing horror. The entity wasn't just a mindless predator, it was intelligent, using its preserved victims as extensions of its will. Lucy turned toward the barn, her head tilting at an impossible angle as she seemed to look directly at Sarah's hiding place. When she spoke, her voice carried the wet, echoing quality of something speaking underwater. As Sarah, the word dripped with false affection. "Come home, sister, mother's been waiting." The mention of their mother sent ice through Sarah's veins. Margaret Thompson had been dead for 5 years, buried in the cemetery beyond the town limits. But if the entity could preserve and animate the dead from Millbrook, what was to stop it from claiming older graves? "We can be together again," Lucy continued, taking another shambling step forward. "All of us. Forever." Behind Lucy, other figures emerged from the sinkhole's depths. Sarah recognized faces from old newspaper clippings about Millbrook's disappearance. The mayor, the school principal, children who would have been adults now if they'd lived. All of them moving with that same unnatural gait, all of them staring at the barn with hungry, hollow eyes. The main creature began to pulse, its bioluminescence growing brighter. Where its light touched the farmyard, plants withered and blackened, the very soil seeming to drain of life. Sarah understood with crystalline clarity that this thing had been feeding on her land for months, slowly draining the nutrients that made her crops fail, her livestock sicken. The baby kicked hard against her ribs as if sensing the supernatural threat. Sarah placed both hands over her belly, feeling the fierce protectiveness that had driven her to fight for the farm surge through her again. She wouldn't let this abomination take her family, her child, her future. Inside the house, the lights flickered and died. Marcus's silhouette appeared at the window, and Sarah could see him searching the darkness for her. The radio static had become a rhythmic pulse that matched the creature's luminescent throbbing. Lucy took another step closer, her dead fingers reaching out in a mockery of sisterly affection. "Don't fight it, Sarah. You can't win. We tried to run too, but it found us. It always finds us." The circle of reanimated corpses tightened around the barn, and Sarah knew her time for hiding was over. In her pocket, her fingers found the small canister of agricultural chemicals she'd grabbed from the storage shed, not much of a weapon, but perhaps enough to buy her family time to escape. The creature sensed her movement, flowing forward with predatory intent as Sarah prepared to run. The screaming started at dawn. Sarah bolted upright in the makeshift camp they'd established near the forest edge, her hands instinctively covering her swollen belly. The sound wasn't human. It was something between a dying animal and metal being torn apart. It came from the direction of the sinkhole, now barely visible through the morning mist that clung to the devastated farmland. Marcus was already on his feet, rifle in hand. "It's moving," he whispered, his voice hoarse from the sleepless night they'd all endured. "Whatever that thing is, it's coming up." Through the trees, they could see the mycorrhizal network pulsing with an angry red light, the fungal threads that connected everything in the forest glowing like exposed nerves. The ground beneath their feet vibrated with each pulse, and Sarah felt the baby respond with sharp kicks against her ribs. Dr. Chen emerged from behind the truck, her laptop clutched against her chest. She'd been monitoring the electromagnetic readings all night, documenting the impossible energy signatures emanating from below. "The preservation chamber is destabilizing," she said, her scientific composure finally cracking. Whatever symbiotic relationship existed down there for 70 years, we've broken it. Sarah thought of Emma, of her sister's preserved face in that nightmare gallery, and felt a mixture of grief and rage. "Good," she said, surprising herself with the venom in her voice. "Let it burn." But even as she spoke, she knew it wasn't that simple. The entity below had been content to remain hidden, feeding slowly, preserving its collection of human specimens like some twisted museum curator. Now, wounded and exposed, it was angry. The screaming intensified, joined by other sounds, a deep thrumming that seemed to come from the earth itself, and underneath it all, voices. Human voices calling out in languages Sarah didn't recognize, speaking words that made her teeth ache. "The preserved ones," Dr. Chen breathed. "They're waking up." Marcus grabbed Sarah's arm. "We need to leave. Now." But Sarah found herself walking toward the forest instead of away from it. The baby had gone still in her womb, and she could feel something else stirring in its place, a recognition, a connection she didn't want to acknowledge. "Sarah, no!" Marcus lunged after her, but stopped when she turned to face him. Her eyes had changed, taking on the same luminescent quality they'd seen in the fungal threads. "It's not finished with us," she said, her voice carrying harmonics that shouldn't have been possible. "It's been waiting. All these years it's been preparing." The morning mist began to swirl in unnatural patterns, forming spirals that seemed to pull light into themselves. Through the distortion, shapes began to emerge from the sinkhole's depths. They moved with jerky, puppet-like motions, the preserved townspeople of Cedar Hollow, their 70-year slumber finally broken. Emma was among them. Sarah's sister looked exactly as she had at 19, her blonde hair still perfect, her skin unmarked by time or decay. But her eyes were wrong, black holes that reflected the fungal network's pulsing light. When she spoke, her voice was layered with others, a chorus of the preserved. "Sister," Emma said, tilting her head at an angle that was just slightly too far to be natural. "We've been waiting for you to come home." The entity's influence was stronger now, no longer content to work through subtle manipulation. Sarah could feel it pressing against her mind, offering promises wrapped in familiar voices. The farm would be saved, her family would be together, the baby would be born into a world where death was just another kind of preservation. Marcus raised his rifle, but his hands were shaking. "That's not Emma," he said, though his voice cracked on her name. "That's not your sister anymore." Sarah knew he was right, but the knowledge felt distant, muffled by the growing pressure in her skull. The baby stirred again, and she realized with horror that it was responding to the entity's call. Whatever was growing inside her had been touched by the same force that preserved the dead, that had kept Cedar Hollow's residents in their underground tomb for 70 years. Dr. Chen was backing toward the truck, her equipment forgotten. "The symbiosis," she whispered. "It doesn't just preserve, it transforms, creates a new kind of life." The preserved townspeople spread out around them, moving with increasing coordination. Their leader, a tall man in a suit that had gone out of style before Sarah was born, stepped forward. When he smiled, Sarah saw that his teeth had been replaced by the same crystalline structures they'd found coating the sinkhole's walls. "Welcome to Cedar Hollow," he said, his voice echoing with the authority of the thing that controlled him. "Population growing." The baby kicked again, harder this time, and Sarah felt something shift inside her. The entity's influence wasn't just external, it had been working from within, preparing for this moment since the night she'd first approached the sinkhole. She was already becoming something else. The thing that had been Sarah moved differently now, its limbs jerking in unnatural angles as it pursued them through the underground passages. Behind it, the other preserved bodies began to stir with renewed vigor, their movements becoming more coordinated, more purposeful. The hive mind was learning. Margaret's flashlight beam danced wildly across the tunnel walls as she half-carried David deeper into the network. His breathing had grown labored, each step sending fresh blood seeping through the makeshift bandage around his leg. The baby kicked frantically inside her, as if sensing the danger that surrounded them. "There," David gasped, pointing ahead to where the passage split into 3 directions. "The middle one leads to the old mine shaft. If we can collapse it behind us—" A shriek echoed from behind them, impossibly loud and filled with rage. The sound seemed to come from multiple throats at once, a chorus of the long-dead given voice by something that should never have existed. Margaret chose the middle passage without hesitation, pulling David along as fast as his injured leg would allow. The tunnel here was older, carved from rock rather than earth, and the walls were lined with rotting timber supports that creaked ominously with each passing second. "The dynamite," David wheezed. "Left side, about 50 yards ahead. Should still be good if the moisture hasn't gotten to it." Behind them, the scratching and shuffling of multiple bodies filled the air. Margaret risked a glance back and immediately wished she hadn't. The thing wearing Sarah's face was crawling along the ceiling now, its fingers elongated into claw-like appendages that scraped against the stone. Its mouth had opened wider than any human jaw should allow, revealing rows of teeth that definitely hadn't belonged to her sister. The other bodies followed in a grotesque parade, men, women, children, all moving with the same unnatural grace, their preservation making their appearance even more horrifying. These weren't zombies or ghosts, they were puppets, and something ancient and hungry was pulling their strings. Margaret spotted the dynamite cache exactly where David had indicated, a wooden crate tucked into an alcove, protected by a tarp that had seen better decades. Her hands shook as she pried open the lid, revealing sticks of explosives that looked far older than anything she was comfortable handling. "The fuses," David said, collapsing against the wall, "should be—" A body dropped from the ceiling behind them with a wet thud. Margaret spun around to find the Sarah thing crouched in the tunnel opening, its head tilted at an angle that would have snapped a living person's neck. When it smiled, black fluid leaked from the corners of its mouth. "You can't run from what you are," it said in Sarah's voice, though the words seemed to come from somewhere else entirely. "This land owns you. It owned her. It owned all of them." More bodies filled the tunnel behind the creature, pressing forward with increasing urgency. Margaret fumbled with the fuses, her pregnant belly making it difficult to maneuver in the cramped space. "The sinkhole isn't random," the Sarah thing continued, rising to its full height with movements that defied anatomy. "It's a mouth. It's been feeding for longer than this town has existed. Your family farm. You think it was your grandfather's luck that made the soil so rich?" The fuses finally cooperated, and Margaret struck a match with trembling fingers. The flame caught, and she began lighting the charges with systematic desperation. "Bone meal makes excellent fertilizer," the creature hissed, taking a step forward. "Generation after generation feeding the land, feeding what sleeps beneath. And now it's time for you to join them." David struggled to his feet, positioning himself between Margaret and the approaching horror. "The hell it is," he growled, raising his shotgun despite the futile nature of the gesture. Margaret lit the last fuse and grabbed David's arm. "Run!" They stumbled deeper into the mine shaft as the fuses burned behind them, their light creating dancing shadows that made the tunnel walls seem alive. The Sarah thing let out another shriek and lunged forward, followed by its chorus of preserved companions. The explosion, when it came, was deafening in the confined space. The tunnel shook violently, and chunks of rock began raining down from the ceiling. Margaret felt the concussion wave hit her back like a physical blow, sending her sprawling forward onto her hands and knees. Behind them, the screaming continued, not human screams, but something else entirely, something that spoke of rage and hunger that had existed since before humans learned to name their fears. The tunnel collapse had bought them time, nothing more. Margaret hauled herself upright, helping David to his feet. Her flashlight beam revealed another passage ahead, this one sloping upward toward what she desperately hoped was the surface. "It's not over," David said quietly, blood trickling from his nose. "That thing, it's connected to something bigger, something that's been here all along." Margaret nodded grimly. One hand pressed to her belly. Whatever was down there had been patient for decades. It could wait a little longer. The thing that had once been Sarah's sister moved with impossible fluidity through the crystalline network, her preserved flesh rippling like water as tendrils of the entity flowed through her. Emma pressed herself against the cavern wall, her hand instinctively protecting her belly as the abomination that wore Lily's face turned those milk-white eyes toward her. "You came back for me," the creature spoke with Lily's voice, though harmonics of something ancient and hungry threaded through each word. "Just like I knew you would." Emma's throat constricted. The resemblance was perfect, every freckle, every curve of her sister's smile, but the wrongness of it made her stomach churn. Behind the Lily thing, she could see other figures moving within the crystal matrix: Mayor Hendricks, the Walsh family, dozens of faces she recognized from the faded newspaper photographs, all of them perfectly preserved, all of them puppets dancing on invisible strings. "Let her go," Emma whispered, though she wasn't sure if she was speaking to the entity or to some fragment of her sister that might still exist within that horrific fusion. The Lily thing tilted its head with predatory curiosity. "Let her go. But she's part of me now, part of something so much greater than she ever could have been alone." It stepped closer, crystal formations sprouting from the ground with each footfall. "Just like you will be, just like the child you carry." Emma felt the baby kick, as if responding to the threat. The movement gave her strength, reminding her why she'd descended into this nightmare in the first place. Her family farm, her unborn child, David waiting somewhere above. She had to survive this. "The town," she said, backing deeper into the cavern. "Millbrook. You took them all at once, didn't you?" The thing wearing Lily's skin laughed, a sound like breaking glass. "Took them? I saved them, gave them purpose. They were dying slowly. Drought, failed crops, economic collapse. I offered them preservation, eternal existence, as your slaves. As my children." The entity's voice dropped to a whisper that seemed to come from the walls themselves. "I have been alone for so long, Emma, waiting in the deep places, dreaming of the surface world. When the water table dropped and the first cracks appeared, I could finally reach up, finally touch the roots, the foundations, finally feed." Emma's mind raced. The drought that had devastated the region decades ago, it had exposed the entity, allowed it to extend its influence upward. The recent dry spell was doing the same thing, creating new pathways, new opportunities to hunt. That's why the sinkhole opened now, she realized. "You're getting stronger." The Lily thing smiled with too many teeth. "The earth is changing. The old barriers are weakening. Soon I won't need to wait for drought or human curiosity to bring me sustenance. I'll be able to reach the surface myself." Emma felt something shift beneath her feet and looked down to see delicate crystal threads beginning to emerge from cracks in the stone. The entity was trying to trap her, to add her to its collection. She stumbled backward, but the cavern seemed to be shrinking, the walls closing in. "Don't fight it," the Lily thing crooned. "It doesn't hurt. You'll still be you, but better, stronger, and your child—" "Oh, Emma, imagine what I could make of a life that's never known the surface world. Pure potential, unmarked by human limitations." "No." Emma's voice was stronger now, powered by maternal fury. "You can't have us." She pulled the emergency flare from her jacket, the one David had insisted she carry, and struck it against the cavern wall. Red light blazed through the crystalline chamber, and the entity's network recoiled as if burned. The Lily thing shrieked, its perfect features contorting into something inhuman. "Iron phosphide," Emma gasped, remembering her father's lessons about soil chemistry. "You can't tolerate it." The flare wouldn't last long, but it might give her a chance. She held it high and began moving toward what she hoped was an exit, watching the crystal formations retreat from the chemical fire. The puppeted corpses followed at a distance, their movements jerky and uncertain without the entity's direct control. Behind her, she heard something massive stirring in the deepest part of the cavern, the true form of whatever had been masquerading as her sister. The sound was like tectonic plates grinding together, like the earth itself screaming. "You cannot escape." The entity's voice boomed from every surface. I am in the water, in the soil, in the very bedrock beneath your feet. Your farm sits above my domain. I will have you, Emma Morrison. I will have you all. The flare sputtered, its light beginning to fade. Emma ran toward the distant promise of natural stone, toward air that didn't taste of copper and ancient hunger. Behind her, the sound of pursuit grew louder, not just footsteps, but the crack and groan of living crystal reshaping itself into something designed for chase. The fungal network pulsed beneath Sarah's feet as she stood at the edge of the sinkhole, cradling her newborn daughter against her chest. The baby's eyes, impossibly alert for something so young, reflected the bioluminescent glow rising from the depths. 3 days had passed since the birth. 3 days since the entity had retreated deeper into the earth, taking most of the preserved bodies with it. But not all of them. Emma stood beside her, translucent in the morning light, her teenage face serene for the first time since Sarah had found her in that underground chamber. The fungal threads that had kept her suspended between life and death were finally releasing their hold. It's time, Emma whispered, her voice like wind through wheat stalks. Sarah nodded, tears streaming down her face. She'd gained a sister only to lose her again, but this time it was different. This time it was Emma's choice. The baby, Sarah said, looking down at her daughter. Will she be normal? Emma's laugh held no bitterness. Look at her, Sarah. Really look. The infant's skin held the faintest luminescence, barely perceptible in daylight, but unmistakable to Sarah's eyes. Where the entity's spores had touched her during those final moments in the chamber, they'd left their mark. Not malevolent, Emma assured her, but protective. A symbiosis rather than a parasitism. She'll be the guardian, Emma continued. When it tries to rise again, and it will, eventually, she'll be ready. The farm stretched out behind them, scarred but healing. The insurance money would cover the immediate damage, and Tom was already planning how to fill the sinkhole. They'd tell people it was a geological anomaly, a story the state inspectors were all too willing to believe rather than dig deeper into something they couldn't explain. Sheriff Martinez had been easier to convince than expected. The official report would list the missing persons from Millbrook as victims of the original disaster 43 years ago, finally recovered due to shifting geological conditions. Some truths were too dangerous for public consumption. What about Dr. Reeves? Sarah asked. Emma's expression darkened slightly. Some people choose to become part of something larger. He made his choice long ago when he first started feeding the network with information about missing persons. The entity needed fresh genetic material to maintain the preservation process. Sarah shuddered, remembering the doctor's final moments as the fungal mass consumed him. He'd been smiling even as the tendrils wrapped around his throat. The baby stirred against her chest, making soft cooing sounds that seemed to harmonize with the deep vibrations still emanating from below. Sarah felt rather than heard the entity's response, acknowledgement of sorts, a reluctant acceptance of the new arrangement. It's afraid of her, Sarah realized. Not afraid. Respectful. She carries both human consciousness and enough of its essence to communicate. She'll grow up knowing things we can't understand, but she'll choose humanity. That's what makes her dangerous to it. Tom's truck rumbled up the dirt road, returning from town with the specialists who would begin the containment process. They thought they were dealing with an unusual fungal bloom. Dangerous but manageable. They had no idea they were essentially negotiating a treaty with something that had existed since before recorded history. I should go, Emma said, her form already beginning to fade as the sun climbed higher. The connection that kept me here is breaking down. Will I see you again? In her, Emma touched the baby's forehead with fingers that passed through like cool mist. I'll always be part of what protects this place now, part of what protects her. Sarah felt the farm's presence differently now, as if the land itself had developed consciousness. The wheat would grow again, stronger and more resilient than before. The soil would be rich with nutrients from the entity's retreat, but also watchful, ready to signal any return of the ancient threat. The trucks were getting closer, bringing men with equipment and theories that would never touch the true nature of what had happened here. Sarah would play her part, the traumatized pregnant woman who discovered an archaeological anomaly. She'd rebuild the farm, raise her daughter, and wait. Because Emma was right, it would try to rise again someday. Perhaps not for decades, perhaps not for generations, but eventually. When it did, the guardian would be waiting. The baby opened her eyes fully for the first time, and Sarah saw in them an intelligence that was both entirely human and something else entirely. Her daughter would grow up knowing the weight of her purpose, but also surrounded by love and normalcy. She would be Sarah's child first, humanity's protector second. As Emma's form dissolved completely into the morning light, Sarah whispered a promise to the wind, to the earth, to the strange new future stretching out before them. "We'll be ready." The entity's response rumbled up through the ground beneath her feet, not a threat, but an acknowledgement. The ancient war had ended not in victory or defeat, but in an understanding that would define generations to come.